Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure as the director of the Baker Institute to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tonight's event is part of the Civic Scientist Program, which is a major component of the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program. A civic scientist is defined as someone who uses his or her knowledge, accomplishments, and skills to help bridge the gap between science and society. As a result, the program is based on the premise that a more informed and engaged society will lead to improved science policy in both the private and the government sectors. The program recognizes that it is part of the job of publicly funded scientists and engineers to engage with the broader population with the goal of being a vital link between science and the public good. The program has sent scientists, doctors, and engineers to local schools to discuss careers in science, reaching over 4,000 local students in the past 5 years. It also researches the role of science in federal policy development. One example is the ongoing project to interview former members of a presidential science advisory committee. In addition, the program sponsors a lecture series which highlights outstanding scientists and engineers. These esteemed figures include Richard Smalley, Bob Curl, who I believe is with us tonight, and Harold Kroto, all who won the Nobel Prize for the buckyball. Noted Houstonian physician-scientists like the late John Mendelsohn and Baker Institute fellow Peter Hotez. Prominent women in science, Marcia McNutt and Jeanette Wing, and of course, our very own Neil Lane, and tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Kelvin Droegemeier. The Civic Scientist Program would not be possible without our generous sponsors. So I would like to thank Rice University's Brown School of Engineering and the Weiss School of Natural Sciences, as well as Rice's Department of Physics and Astronomy that is co-sponsoring tonight's event as their annual Rorschach Lecture. We are also especially grateful to Benjamin and Winifred Cheng for their considerable support of this Civic Scientist Program. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Neil Lane. Neil is the Baker Institute Senior Fellow in Science and Technology Policy and a Professor Emeritus of Physics and Astronomy at Rice. Neil served as the Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy from 1998 to 2001, and also as Director of the National Science Foundation from 1993 to 1998. So throughout Neil's career, he's been a living example of a civic scientist who understands and promotes the very important nexus between science, education, and public policy. So please welcome Neil Lane to the podium.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I would like to remind all of us to silence our cell phones. And I believe I did mine, but if I've made a mistake, I'll apologize later. We also will, because of the time this evening and the size of our audience, we're going to take questions by cards. So did you find cards in your seats so that if you have questions, write them briefly, please, because I got to read them and pass them along to Kelvin. And then if you just hold them up along the way, people will come by and pick them up. As Ambassador just said, this lecture is part of the Civic Scientist Program, and it really is a key element of all of our science and technology activities. The Ambassador has recognized our generous supporters, and I want to add my special thanks, especially to Benjamin and Winifred Cheng, who were happy, I'm happy to say, are here this evening. Certainly without them, we couldn't do these lectures and many of our other activities. We're also delighted that the lecture is being co-sponsored by the Department of Physics and Astronomy as the Harold E. Rorschach Jr. Lecture. Harold Rorschach, known as Bud, was a longtime faculty member, a distinguished researcher, low-temperature physics, biophysics. He was a legendary prize-winning teacher, as many who had Bud Rorschach in class would attest. He was chairman of the department for many years. He was chairman when I came to Rice, and he was just an extraordinary leader and mentor to me over those many years. The series, the Rochelle Lecture Series, was established to highlight the impact of physics on the greater body of knowledge and culture, including public policy. We're also happy members of the Rochelle family could be with us this evening. This evening's civic scientist and Rochelle lecturer, Dr. Kelvin Droegemeier, is a distinguished scientist. He's an administrator, public servant. He was appointed as President Trump's science advisor and director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy last fall, and he began in January of this year. Prior to his White House appointment, he was on the faculty of the University of Oklahoma for 33 years. He was professor of meteorology, which of course is all about physics, and vice president for research for many years. He also served as the Oklahoma governor's secretary for science and technology on her cabinet. I think I should probably disclose to this audience that I was born in Oklahoma City, as my wife Johnny was, and we're both OU alums. Any other OU alums here today? Any UT alums? Any Aggies? Texas Tech? U of H? SMU? Calvin, I give you some idea what you're up against. Look, they're all very friendly. I should have missed. Didn't get everybody. They're very friendly, but if you can steer clear of football, I think it might be, it's going to go better this evening. Kelvin served 2 6-year terms on the National Science Board, and which is really the policy-making arm of the National Science Foundation. He was vice chairman of that board for 4 years. Kelvin and I have been friends for a long time. I've enjoyed working with him and on higher education issues and science policy. And when his appointment was announced, it drew praise pretty much uniformly across the community. And President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, said, quote, "He's a very good pick. He has experience speaking science to power." Kelvin's touring the country right now. He's talking with university faculty and administrators and other concerned parties about some very important issues that have implications for the health and future of science in America. Kelvin's always made it clear that science should be nonpartisan. He's working on Pennsylvania Avenue, however, and there isn't much that doesn't take on some kind of partisan flavor from time to time. That's one of the challenges. But in his confirmation hearing, he said the following: "My role, if I am confirmed as director of OSTP," that's what you have to say because you're the confirmation hearing, so you're not presumptuous. Otherwise, you would say, "when you confirm me as," okay, anyway, he didn't say all that. His job is to bring unbiased science, the best science available to the executive branch, to all parties, and make sure that information is at the table and available for policymaking. That's what his job is all about. It's a hard job, but I can think of nobody better to take it on. Since his research field is meteorology and atmospheric physics, extreme weather events is what he studied and was recognized expert as. So I'm thinking that background is serving him well in Washington, where the winds always blow strong. Please welcome Kelvin Droegemeier.
Thank you so much, Neil, for that gracious introduction. And I am just pleased beyond belief and honored to be here with you tonight. And I thank you all for coming. This is an extraordinary institution, Rice University. It's contributed so much to the nation's advances in science and technology, research and education. I've been pleased to have strong interactions with Rice over the years. I work with Phil Bedian, who's a hydrologist. Also, Ken Kennedy and I founded a National Science Foundation Science Technology Centers at the same year in 1989, 30 years ago actually this year. And I miss Ken greatly. his Center for Research in Parallel Computation was very complementary to the center I founded, and so we became friends, and I really gained a great respect for that wonderful man of science. And I'll tell you, this university has such a rich history in producing really extraordinary leaders. So it's been my great privilege to know Neil Lane, a great friend and a man of great wisdom who I've turned to many, many times throughout my career for advice and counsel on a variety of different topics. We, of course, are Oklahoma Sooners born and bred, and I tell you, you will not find somebody who's more willing to give of themselves, give of their time than Neil Lane. Now, whatever question you have, whatever it is, you text Neil and say, hey, do you have a few minutes for me? And he always comes back and says, yes, here's my phone number, please give me a call. And I think it really exemplifies what Rice is all about, that giving spirit, that creative spirit, and that spirit of always being interested and willing to help. So I've had a fantastic day today. Began by visiting a magnet high school, the Energy Institute High School. It was absolutely an extraordinary experience. I can see why Norm Augustine, Neil, when he went there, came away and is still talking about it. It's really unbelievable, and I would hope that many of our institutions of higher education would aspire to do things as creative and wonderful as that high school is doing. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And also spent wonderful time with students and faculty talking about a variety of issues, answering some difficult questions, which I really love. I'm glad people here think deeply about issues. They're very, very important issues and challenges facing the nation, but also great opportunities. So I'm going to share a few things with you tonight that I hope you'll find interesting and challenging and also inspirational. And I titled this The Second Bold Era of American Science and Technology. And I truly believe, and I've been in this business for 35 years, that there's been no better time in the history of our country, and certainly in the history of the world right now, to be doing what I and many of you are also doing, and that is being in the area of science and technology, research and education. You look at the amount of knowledge and understanding that we have about the natural world, it's really extraordinary and really unparalleled in the history of mankind. Our ability to really understand the physical world, the human body, the human genome, even storm chasing. My goodness, when I was storm chasing as an undergraduate at OU, we would go out and we'd drive 3 or 4 hours and hope to see a tornado, and we would come back listening to Dust in the Wind on the radio because the skies cleared out and we had no idea why. And now we have freshmen coming to OU studying meteorology. Their first storm chase, they see 3 tornadoes in an afternoon. And so it's really extraordinary when you think that the tremendous advances that we've made in knowledge. Our capabilities of things like supercomputers that can crunch vast quantities of information to simulate the real world. Things like our repositories of publications like PubMed Central at the National Institutes for Health. Incredible capabilities where we can actually grab hold of hundreds, if not thousands, or even millions of publications at a moment's notice. For me, I had to go to the library and wait till the next journal issue arrived, and I'd sit there studiously looking at it and couldn't wait for the next month's issue. And now you have access to basically everything online. Of course, we look at the capabilities, as I say, in health research and medical research, the tremendous breakthroughs that have happened. And finally, of course, our ability to communicate across vast distances and multiple time zones. It used to be you had to get on an airplane or you would collaborate by sending letters. Now through the internet, we can exchange information, we can do real-time collaboration. Those boundaries of time and space have basically vanished. So we are really at an absolutely unparalleled time in the history of the world in terms of our capability to solve some of the most challenging problems that confront us, but also seize some of the greatest opportunities in front of us. But I also want to make a point about where we are, and that is, I think, the best place on planet Earth to be doing what we're doing in science and engineering research education. There is no better place to be than right here in America, where we lead the world in science and technology. You look at our research universities. We have 7 of the top 10 universities in the world. Rice University, an extraordinary institution that's made numbers of breakthroughs throughout its history. You look at other universities, extraordinary capabilities across the more than 600 research universities and institutions that we have in this country. You look at our federal and national laboratories, our 17 DOE national laboratories, unparalleled in the world, just extraordinary institutions. You also add our private companies and our nonprofit organizations, which I have learned as a federal employee, I can't put a picture up there because if I did, I would be implicitly endorsing a private company. So I just have to tell you that there are these incredible private companies out there. You know who they are. They're trillion-dollar companies doing things like launching satellites into orbit, which is extraordinary because when Sputnik happened in 1957, the only entity that could have mounted a response, that did mount a response, was the federal government. Today, it might be company X, Ooh, did I say that? Company X, forget, it's just some company with an X, and it could be company Y, company Z, I don't know. It could be a lot of different companies. But I tell you what, the thing that really, really, really makes this work, it makes it work for America, is our American values. Our research enterprise and knowledge, the capabilities of physical resources, our institutions fundamentally work so well because they're underpinned by our values. First of all, our freedom to discover and create. The ability to take an idea and just absolutely run with it, to create, to understand the real world, to unleash that incredible human curiosity, which is innate in our spirit, is something that we really do so well in this country. The openness that we have as a nation and reciprocity, when other folks come from other countries, we open our arms to them and say, come and study in our labs, come and work in our libraries, come and explore with us, discover the world around us with us, help us learn together. The sharing of results, our free market economy, where we can move research outcomes into the private sector, where we can build results and benefits for society. This is extraordinary. I met a 14-year-old a week or two ago, actually 2 weeks ago, who started his own private company. He's the CEO of a private company, and it's really an extraordinary thing he's doing. You know, and a lot of students in college are now creating private companies and doing startups. Where in America could you really see this happening? So these are really important values that are fundamental to who we are. And I want you to kind of keep this in mind, because I'm going to come back in a moment and talk about some other values that are extremely important as well, that really get to some of the challenges but also the opportunities that we face. Now, how did we get here? Those of you who are students of history of science, and this is very, very recent history, will know a gentleman by the name of Vannevar Bush. He was President Roosevelt's kind of de facto science advisor. There was no OSTP back then, but he was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II. And in 1944, as the war was going well, President Roosevelt asked Vannevar Bush, he said, you know, there's this incredible enterprise we have at Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project. It's doing very, very well. Clearly, things are moving in the right direction for us. How do we take this incredible enterprise and move it into the benefit of civil society? So Vannevar Bush, who later founded a company you might have heard of called Raytheon, a very, very impressive guy, he wrote this treatise called Science, the Endless Frontier. And the title of my talk is The Second Bold Era. So that would say, okay, well, what's the first bold era? And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But we're in an endless frontier that he really envisioned. And so he basically said this, it's a beautiful, simple document. It's got three principal parts to it. The first part, he said, the federal government has an obligation fundamentally to invest in basic or discovery research. Research that's too risky for a private company to invest in. And that's something that holds true today. Second thing, he said, we have to make sure that those returning from the war effort and also subsequent generations are developed and are the engineers and the scientists of the future. And the third pillar, he said, if it doesn't have to be classified, let's make it open. You kind of think open science, open access by our terminology today. And those three fundamental pillars have really shaped the whole science enterprise from the time that he delivered this report to then President Truman in 1945, because President Roosevelt passed away in April of that year. And this is what really essentially led to the creation of the National Science Foundation and the enterprise as we know it today. So the ecosystem that we have has sort of four fundamental pillars to it. The private sector, the academic research institutions, our research universities, our nonprofits, and also the federal government itself. And when you add up the dollars that are spent every year, and these numbers, of course, change from year to year, but if you kind of squint your eyes and look at the numbers overall, it's about $600 billion of investment in R&D across all of these sectors every year. So when you put this with our federal and national laboratories, you put it with our American values, we have an absolutely extraordinary, truly unparalleled R&D enterprise anywhere in the world. And that's why this is the best time in the history of the world, the best place on the planet to actually be doing R&D. But my argument is that we're entering a second bold era. And the starting point is not post-World War II, where we're having to rebuild Europe, and they're kind of, you know, there's very serious challenges out there. We've got GIs returning. We're at this time in history where we have extraordinary capabilities that really no problem is beyond our reach. The capabilities we have all put together, all the facilities, all the knowledge and know-how are such that we can basically tackle any problem. So this is a second bold era that we've really turned the page that we're entering into. But it's an interesting era in itself because of, if you look at, in this chart, you've probably seen various versions of this. The top line red graph shows USA R&D investment growing. It's been growing and growing, but you see the blue curve down below China, which is growing much more rapidly. And, we celebrate science anywhere. As someone said, it's good for science everywhere. We celebrate the development of new ideas and new discoveries and things like that. The question is, what are we in America doing to make sure that we remain the world leader in science and technology, which is certainly one of the things that I think about, really the most important thing I think about every day when I wake up. So I want to tell you a little bit with that backdrop of what OSTP does and what it's about, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And Neil Lane here, as you heard, led OSTP back in the Clinton years. And Neil did a very unselfish, wonderful thing. Before he left, or right maybe after he left, he wrote a memo to all subsequent OSTP directors. And it was not something he published. It was a very personal kind of thing intended only for those who followed him. And it was the most important piece of wisdom that I think I've ever received in my entire life, because it was sort of a North Star guiding me as I entered the White House. Obviously a very, very different time, but also a time when I really wanted to make sure I understood how to be as effective as possible in my position. So OSTP itself, with this selfless guidance by Neil, was actually created back in 1976, a public law signed into law by President Ford. And you say, well, what does OSTP do? Different people describe it differently, but I'll make it really simple. Oh, that's an interesting thing. The slides went a little bit weird there. Let me go back. What this is supposed to say up top is policy for science and science for policy. Policy for science means that what OSTP does is we help use policy to set the science agenda for the nation. I'll come back to this in a moment. But for example, what are the research priorities of the country? What are the key important top-line things that we ought to be working on? How do we ensure that we have, as Vannevar Bush said, the workforce of the future? How do we make sure that we are educating? How do we make sure that we draw upon all parts of the country so that everyone has an opportunity to create? That's a policy that is helping put in place the agendas and the mission and the budgets for our science agencies. The second one down there is science for policy. How do we make sure when we're facing important policy decisions, for example, like the Ebola virus, the Zika virus, other kinds of things that we face, how do we make sure that we bring the science forward to inform those policy decisions? So that's one way to think of it, but I'm a meteorologist, okay? I'm really simple, and I hope some of you on your cards ask the question, what's the weather going to be tomorrow? Okay, because that I know I can answer. I mean, it's going to be light, number one. I'm sure of that. I looked at the forecast. It's going to be partly cloudy, and it's going to be cold. So still, please write it down, and I'll repeat the answer, and that way it'll be really easy in this Q&A session. But what we do at OSTP, what I do, I think of this every day. I wake up and say, how can I make sure that America leads the world in science and technology? And I do that in three ways. One is, as a faculty member, as a professor, as a researcher who's had lots of graduate students and postdocs, I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to unleash that human curiosity innate in all of us. That spirit to understand. When you were little, you took a stick and you poked bugs with it, you dug in the ground. You wanted to know how things work. Back in those days, you could take a clock radio apart or something like that and get yelled at by your parents. You can't really do that today very easily, but we're all curious about how the world works. And so unleashing discovery and innovation and curiosity is very, very important. Second piece is, of course, building the workforce of the future. Things like STEM education, making sure that we have broad participation from all elements of our great nation, and also bringing in international folks to collaborate with us, very important. Then finally, something I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and that is advancing our values at home and abroad. So when I talk about the American values, this is something I think we need to do a much better job of messaging to those who are coming into science and engineering research and education these days. We wake up in America every day and we sort of forget how lucky we are, how fortunate we are. And one of the things I think we need to do is remind ourselves constantly, and also those who are following us in the next generation, how fortunate they are to have the freedom to discover and innovate and create and chase their ideas and dreams. And I'll come back to that here in a little bit. But this OSTP, if you want to learn a little bit more about it, of course, the Baker Institute played an important role in sort of helping me think about what OSTP ought to be doing in this administration, because back in 2015, I believe it probably was, Neil Lane invited me to serve on a fairly small group of folks to look at the vital role, as it says on the right there, of OSTP in the new administration. Now, this document was written and it came out before the election of 2016. And so it was completely neutral. It was bipartisan. It basically said, here's what OSTP does, here's what it needs to do, and here's how it ought to operate. And I have read this thing so much, the version I have is about ready to fall apart. And it was a great privilege to me to serve in this capacity, and I think a wonderful testament to the value of the Baker Institute, which I'm very, very delighted to be here speaking at tonight. And of course, then we have another document there on the left. The Congressional Research Service kind of updates this regularly to give you a kind of a running tracking of what OSTP is doing. So that's kind of an important thing. Now, of course, I have to show you an org chart here for just a second, but I do this for a particular reason. There are two things in pink there that you see that I'm going to come back to in a moment. The National Science Technology Council and PCAST there on the right, the President's Council of Advisors in Science Technology. And there's a report that the Baker Institute put out. It noted that OSTP can have up to 4 Senate-confirmed associate directors in 4 sort of areas below the director. And we have science, we have technology, and we have the national security director. We don't have 4, we actually have 3. And then we have lots of other folks that work at OSTP. And I'm going to show you some of what these folks do to give you a flavor for the kinds of things we're working on. But here's somebody you might recognize on the right. I don't know if you recognize the guy on the left. He looks pretty much the way he does today. But there's our own Neil Lane giving advice to President Clinton. And I tell you, I know Neil would agree with this. It's an extraordinary privilege to be working in the White House. There's not a day that goes by, or even a minute of a day, where you lose the notion of, oh my gosh, I'm in the White House. So it's a very humbling experience. It's a huge privilege with a great deal of responsibility, but also a great deal of excitement to be working on behalf of the entire country to make sure that America is the world's leader in science and technology. Now, Neil came to OU and gave a talk about I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and he was lamenting the fact that the president's parking place was there on the south lawn with Marine One, and there's the Oval Office, and Neil said, well, here's my parking place, you know. I thought, yeah, that's you know, you're on West Executive Avenue. The building that we work in is in the lower right-hand corner, the Eisenhower building. But Neil, I want to point out something to you. That was all in Washington, and Kelvin's parking place is still in Oklahoma. So you had it a lot better than I did, even though you weren't quite on the south lawn. But I've got my Harley a couple of thousand miles away. So anyway, just so you know, you had it good, and I don't have it quite so good. One of the things that we do at OSTP is we help set the top-line priorities for agencies. And so agencies, we work together with all the heads of agencies, and we all want to know, okay, what are the big things that we want to go after? What are the top-line priorities? This is a really, really difficult memo to write. You do it jointly with the Office of Management and Budget, and you do it every summer. And obviously, you can't include everything, so you really have to pare it down. And I just want to share with you what the priority areas are right now, because universities look very closely at this, vice presidents for research, and also private companies, because it's sort of a vector of where we're going in the country. So the first one is American security. I think, you know, President Trump is extremely strong on our military, making sure that we defend the homeland, making sure that we have a very strong presence. So American security is an important top-line issue. Industries of the future, AI, quantum information science, 5G, advanced manufacturing, and synthetic biology, which is not on the slide, but I need to add that. Those are very, very important industries that are really important in the sense of they have decadal timescales. And they look to really transform the workforce and transform society in very profound and very important and very positive ways. And we have taken an international leadership role in these areas technologically and also in terms of policy and setting important principles for things like the operation of artificial intelligence. Energy and environmental leadership, very, very important. And I have to say there's something there at the bottom of that. You see Earth system predictability. That's sort of a bit of an impact that I'm hoping to make to really say we need to understand more about how predictable the Earth system really is. We can predict, but if we know more about predictability, we know more about where to invest, how much to invest, and how to guide our investments in certain things like hurricane track, intensity forecasting, various things like that, very, very small scale, very, very large scale. So understanding how predictable something is extremely important. Health and the bioeconomy. We had a big summit in Washington a couple of weeks ago on the bioeconomy. This is extremely important going forward. It's a lot of things. It's the intersection of health and engineering and biomedicine and data and all kinds of things, but it's really, really extremely important, and it offers enormous promise for curing insidious diseases, for especially curing and addressing diseases that are not very common. Because believe me, it's difficult to invest in diseases where not a lot of people die. I mean, that's just simply a reality. So there's great promise here for addressing some of those challenges. And finally, I think, as you know better than anyone here in Houston, we're going to the moon in 2024. Very exciting for the Artemis mission. Of course, Jim Bridenstine, who's a graduate of Rice University, very proud graduate, and a good friend of mine, is doing an extraordinary job leading NASA. So those are very, very exciting areas. But you know what? I don't want to talk about those tonight. What I want to talk about are some of the cross-cutting areas, things that I think are important for weaving together this enterprise to really make it extraordinary and continue its world leadership. Build and diverse a highly skilled American workforce. So we had 5 top-line research priorities, 5 cross-cutting priorities. And in some sense, I don't want the cross-cutting priorities to get lost in the shuffle, because we're not necessarily talking about a lot of money here, but we are talking about extremely important issues. So highly skilled, diverse workforce, very, very important diversity. Supporting research environments that reflect our values. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is really important. It's something I'm going to drill down on here in just a minute, and that is supporting really high intellectual risk research, something I think, frankly, we've gotten away from in this country and we need to get back to. Leveraging the power of data. Okay, data are extremely important. Data are everywhere. Data are being produced at massive rates. You know, we're drowning in data. How do we thoughtfully turn data into useful information? And finally, partnerships, multi-sector partnerships, and I'll come back to that. So let me start right now with partnerships and say just a few words about that. As a researcher, what we all tend to see and think of is my little part of this agency's budget. And if that budget goes down, my world collapses. And you know, that's an absolutely appropriate thing to think about. Now, if you're a dean of a college, you might say, I'm looking at more of the pieces of the puzzle put together. Whereas a faculty member says, I see my piece there, a dean or a provost might say, I see the bigger pieces. What we all need to see is the box top of the puzzle. And by that, what I mean is we need to see our enterprise for the totality of what it is, not just the individual pieces. So how do we go from a bunch of pieces that we all see bits and pieces of to us seeing the box top and appreciating the collective integration and interaction across the enterprise? So the hypothesis that I'd like to put out there is that we can get a force multiplier in our country by having stronger engagement across these sectors. Now, there obviously is a lot of engagement going on, a lot of cross-sector activity. But if we could think for a moment about leveraging the tremendous enterprise that we have, the dollars, the people, the resources, and things like that, we don't get an additive effect, we get a multiplicative effect. And we see other countries, remember that graph I showed you, we see other countries investing massively. And we're not investing at that same rate, but we must not forget that the initial condition starting point for us is not where those other countries are. We have tremendous capabilities starting in the second bold era. So how about we take this incredible enterprise we have and we start to become more effective and efficient with it? And that's the idea of these partnerships. So let me just show you an example of why I'm believing that we don't really partner as well as we could. There's lots of good examples of that, but I think there are certain types of partnerships that we haven't even begun to see. So this picture shows in red the growth of industry R&D over the past 50, 60 years, 70 years, and the blue shows the federal government investment, and then all the other stuff is at the top in gray. So what catches your eye when you look at this graph is this dramatic increase in private sector R&D spending. And a lot of this is done within the companies, a lot of it is done sort of in basic research, a lot of it in applied research and development. But if you take that graph and you look at that massive change, and then you look at this graph, which shows where the funding to universities for R&D comes from, the arrow is pointing to the purple color, which is private industry, and you look back down to 1990 and you say, wow, I don't see much change there. So how do you reconcile this growth with this picture? And one of the conclusions I come to is the extraordinary capabilities of our universities, the intellectual talent, the investments by taxpayer dollars, and the tremendous facilities and intellectual capacity we have in students and all this. We're not leveraging that really so much by the private sector. And so partnerships, you read about it, you look, everybody says, you know, we need to be doing more partnerships. There are lots and lots of reports out there. Some people question, is there value in doing this? I think overall we realize that partnerships that are done properly can be extremely effective. So you look at the black hole shadow image. Now, that was sort of a partnership on steroids, right? Turning the disk of the Earth into the aperture of a radio telescope that allowed us to do this image here. extraordinary. It made the front pages of the newspaper all over the world. Everybody recognizes that. So that was an incredible, incredible example. We also have, you see, strategic alliances with historically black colleges and universities. So you have international kind of partnerships. You have very, very local partnerships. In academia, we have lots of partnerships. This is a university industry development project, demonstration partnership project. And there's lots of examples here, like Procter & Gamble and so on and so forth. These big partnerships are wonderful. So they're good examples there. They're good examples across agencies. This is NSF, and they talk about how they partner across different sectors of our federal government. But the question ultimately is, are we getting as much as we can out of partnerships? And so why do we even partner, you know? Well, it's because, somewhat selfishly, but appropriately so, we want to do something that we can't do by ourselves. And so we need somebody to help us, one or more. We need an organization, something, because they allow us to do something we couldn't do. And they bring a lot of things to the table. They bring people, facilities, ideas, money, maybe reputation, linkages, whatever. They bring a lot to the table. And so ultimately, the key elements of partnerships, we've got to have mutual need. That gets us together. We have to have mutual benefit. That kind of keeps us together. The mutual trust is what we really need to have, that is the glue, that is ultimately the thing that allows us to be successful. And ultimately, you have to manage a partnership, just like a marriage or anything else. You have to make sure that you're doing everything you can to have this thing be successful. So we have these great examples, but are we missing opportunities? And so we did a very, very wonderful roundtable on October 31st, where we got together folks from all the agencies that have equities in this for 2 hours, and we had this extraordinary discussion. And it was the most incredible meeting I've been in for many, many, many years, because everybody said, you know what, this is something we need to do a lot better, and we're not doing it very well. We could do a whole lot more. And so we're doing another partnership summit at Stanford in December, and we're going to be convening a big national summit early next year, sometime next spring or late winter in Washington. And I'm absolutely convinced, I won't go into great detail about this, but to say that the partnerships have a lot of unrealized potential. So that's something we're focused on. But there's another thing that we're focused on, and that is, how do you look down the road farther than just the next budget cycle? Now, as a meteorologist, I want to know the future, right, ultimately. I'm not very good at it. I'm not a very good forecaster. Neil will tell you that. Anytime you want, he will tell you that. But, you know, how do we look beyond the next budget cycle? How do we do that? Well, let me give you a weather prediction analog to this, okay? We start with observations, okay? We then assimilate those data, and they go into a numerical model as the initial condition of a forecast, and we produce the forecast. So ultimately, it starts with we get data, we create an initial condition. What's the starting point right now? And that tells us the initial starting point for projecting the weather forward in time. So the analog to this that I want to do, get ready for this, is a 25 to 50 year look ahead down the road as a nation, not as a government, but as a multi-sector, federal government, private sector, nonprofit, university, getting together as a nation, looking where we want to go as a country over the next 25 to 50 years in the research and technology arena. What are the big things that we want to do as America to help set the context for these much, much shorter term budget cycles? So we have a number of data sets like the National Science Board Science Engineering Indicators that can provide that initial condition that says, here's the whole state of the nation, S&E enterprise. This is where we're at today. That's the starting point. But then we do a forecast, and a forecast is a 25 to 50 year look ahead. This sounds like a crazy idea, but when I've talked to agency heads and other people, they say, you know what, we've got to do this because we don't think long enough term. And frankly, sometimes, and I actually talked to Senator Cornyn about this very point, and at that time I said a 25 year, and he said, you're not thinking long enough. You really need to think 50 years down the road. I said, Senator, you're right. That's a really good point. So we changed it to 25 to 50 years looking ahead. And that's really, really important because I think when we do that, it forces us to acknowledge not to have a crystal ball to say we know what the big challenges are, but we know where things really need to go, what needs to shape the future in terms of policy, in terms of research areas, in terms of directions for our federal agencies and our private companies, and the kinds of partnerships that we need to be putting in place that we don't now have. So that's a really, really important thing that we're doing. Another thing I want to point out here is supporting research of high intellectual risk. And I want to bring this really close to home in an example here, back in my days as a researcher. So this is a picture of a National Weather Service forecast back in the late 1990s. And you might wonder where a 20% chance of rain comes from. When you look at that picture, That's where it comes from. Okay, what we're doing is blob forecasting. We're forecasting big blobs of rain over, say, a 12 or 24-hour period. But when you look at what really causes the big challenges and the damage, this is very, very true right here in Texas, whether it's a landfalling hurricane, a tropical storm, or a squall line or something like that. It's the very, very local high-impact weather. So the question that we asked was, can the computer weather technology that we use to forecast the weather, the day-to-day weather, the 20-30% chance of rain, we asked this question back in the late 1980s, is it crazy to think that that might be useful to predict this kind of weather explicitly, to actually predict a thunderstorm 2 or 3 hours in advance? Most people said that's impossible. It's absolutely not possible to do that. This is turbulence. There's no way that you can possibly do that. We said, no, we don't think so. We think that we have what we need. Number one, we need fine-scale data. The Next-Ride radar system was coming to existence in the early 1990s. We said, to predict the fine-scale weather, we need fine-scale data, and the radar observes at very, very fine scales. We need to do something else. The radar observes one dimension of the wind, one of the 3 dimensions of the wind, and if you look at all that the forecast model needs, it needs tons of stuff. It needs 3 wind components: temperature, humidity, pressure. The radar doesn't measure any of that, none of it. So you talk about the ultimate underdetermined problem, but we said we think that we can apply control theory with one component of the wind to determine all these other things uniquely. Okay, more calls for us to be put in a rubber room. You guys are crazy. There's no way this is going to work. But also an important thing happened. The National Science Foundation at that time issued a solicitation, the very first time they did this, to make a big bet on a big idea. And it was the Science Technology Center program that your own Ken Kennedy responded to as well. This solicitation was 4 pages long. How many of you have seen a 4-page solicitation recently? Basically, they said, give us an idea that is probably so ridiculous that it might not be doable, but if you succeed, it could be hugely important from a societal impact point of view. And so we submitted the proposal, and we got the phone call from NSF. This was right before Neil became director, so fortunately it happened, and he didn't have to turn us down. He might have said, you are crazy. It got funded. And so we thought, now we're stuck. We got to go do what we said that we're going to do. And it led to this Center for Analysis and Prediction of Storms. So let me show you an example. Back in Fort Worth in 2000, big tornado came down. This is a TV radar of a hook echo. It's the classic example of a storm. It's what we go to bed dreaming of at night. Unfortunately, some people lost their lives, so I don't want to joke about this. But this is the kind of thing we wanted to predict far in advance. So here's the weather forecast that night from the Weather Service models. People knew something was going to happen, but the model itself did not depict anything. That little oval there is south of the Red River, and nothing was going on. Reality, though, was this. This is what actually happened. Okay, we said, well, okay, this is interesting. What does our model do? So here's the observations at 6, 7, and 8 o'clock in the evening. There's Fort Worth. And here's what our model produced 2, 3, 4 hours in advance. And look at the comparison between the model at the bottom and the observations at the top. We showed it was possible. Now, if you look at other parts of the picture, you'll find out places where the forecast was completely wrong. And so when you're wrong with a forecast like this, you're really wrong. If you put a storm in the wrong place and there's nothing there, you are 100% wrong. But it gave a glimmer of hope that what we thought was possible was in fact possible. And this center still exists today. And now this is a picture of the Joplin Tornado. We took this now nationwide, and this is being done routinely. The Joplin Tornado, the storm there, the model predicted that. This was a 23-hour forecast. So what happened here was NSF made a big bet on a big idea. It was very, very intellectually risky. But here's a letter from the Center for Atmospheric Research, and you can't read it. But what he says down below, what's underlined, he said, he went through this whole argument about, I didn't think this was possible, but he said, wow, we've come a long way. Had NSF not made that big bet, this probably would have happened anyway, but it might have happened 20 years later or more. So this is a great example of an agency making a big bet on a big idea, taking the risk. And what I'm telling you tonight is I think we need to be doing more of this. Another very, very important thing that we're talking about in the cross-cutting priority areas is this idea of the so-called research environments. We can have all of the stuff I talked about earlier, all the funding in the world, all the great intellectual talent, all the resources here. But if the environments in which we do research in this country don't reflect and protect our values, then we actually have a problem. If our values are where women go and they feel I'm harassed all the time, that's the last place I want to be. If we say, you know what, this environment, there's a lot of shenanigans going on there. There's, people not behaving appropriately. They're not, acting with integrity or upholding our research values. Or if there are places where there's crushing administrative burden and nobody wants to go there because they want to do science and all you do when you're doing research is fill out paperwork, we've got the wrong environments and we have to address that. So this is one of the things that OSTP is working on very, very closely, and I want to show you a little bit more about this. So what is a research environment? It's anywhere research takes place. It might be at a pizza parlor where people get together, 6, 8 people, to do a journal club or whatever. The kind of values that we uphold in research absolutely have to apply there. And speaking of those values, here they are. What are the values that we as researchers hold dear, that we live by, the ethos that we live by? It's honesty, integrity, transparency. We're accountable to the to the taxpayers that fund us. We're accountable to one another. We hold each other accountable. In fact, that's one of the most important things about the research enterprise. It's, quote, self-policing. We have rigorous debate on very, very difficult issues, just like I did with the students this afternoon. If any of you are here, I want to thank you for the questions you asked. They were tough questions, but we have to talk about tough issues. But we do it in a very civil way. And I think you all have done this. I saw it in the magnet school today. It was really extraordinary. We respect each other. We treat each other appropriately. These are the values of individual researchers. Now, you remember the values I showed you earlier that were our American values. Those are our national nation-state values. So the question is, are these two aligned? In America, they are. Okay, that our American values that I showed you earlier really comport very nicely with our research values. Unfortunately, in some other countries we deal with, the researcher values are there, but the national values are not. So that is one of the things, among other things, that stimulated us to create something called the Joint Committee on the Research Environment. And I call it a joint committee. Well, where does that term come from? Remember those 2 pink boxes I showed you? Well, one of those was this thing called the National Science and Technology Council, which actually is formally chaired by the President of the United States, President Trump. But the President delegates this authority to the OSTP director, like Neil chaired NSTC when he was director of OSTP. And down below you see 6 committees. Well, don't worry about the details there. What I'm showing you this slide for is that when we created this joint committee to look at the research environment, we took 2 of those committees and brought them together. And I want to say also that in addition to convening the interagency, which is what this thing formally does, we also convene the broad community. So as you heard, I'm out on the road talking with faculty, I'm talking with private companies, we're talking with nonprofits, and we bring them together, we bring them together to talk about some of these issues so that we can find solutions. Because research doesn't happen just in universities, and it's not just the federal government that funds research. So we coordinate and we collaborate and we engage the entire community. So here's what we did. We created these subcommittees of what's called J-Corps. The first one is on rigor, integrity, and reproducibility in research. So fundamentally, what is foundational to our enterprise is operating with integrity and rigor in our science, rigor in investigation, rigor in the use of statistics, and reproducibility where it's appropriate. The second one is on safe and inclusive research environments. Safe in terms of laboratory safety, the kinds of safety you would imagine, but also inclusive in diversity and making sure that these environments are free from harassment of all kinds. And this is not so much something you can do in policy, it's more of a cultural issue. So what's beautiful, I think, about J-Corps is this isn't all just, ooh, let's do policy. It really strikes at the heart of who we are as a nation and how we actually operate in the research enterprise. Research security is the next one. This is how do we find the right balance between protecting our research assets and our wonderful openness of our research enterprise. Openness and international collaboration, very, very important historically. They continue to be very important. But we also are facing new threats and new challenges. So in my mind, this sort of comes down to ultimately our values. And then finally, reducing administrative workload. If we try to, say, address research security issues by imposing a lot of additional workload on our researchers, that's not a good thing. So the beauty of the way J-Corps is structured is all of these 4 areas interrelate with one another. So these subcommittees are led by top-line folks in OSTP and also the agencies, and they are populated by about anywhere from 20 to 25 people or so, and they've met at least 10 times since they began May 6th. So we're driving this agenda really, really hard because I want to see the day where people see the research environment as that shining beacon of integrity and honesty and appropriate behavior where women don't want to leave, but they want to come into. because it's where they're respected, where ideas are respected, where people of color are respected, and things like that. That is what research is about. That's what our integrity is about. That's what we want to really reflect not only to other parts of the country here, but also to the world. So we've had other nations look at what we're doing and saying, we want to be a part of that. Yeah, we talk about research security, and we get that part of it. We're working on that. But you guys at OSTP have brought together all these 4 work streams, and they all interact, and so they're very, very interested in working with us. I love that, because that means that we then lead with our wonderful American values, which are also our research values, and that's how we address these issues. And I sent a letter to the research community explaining what we're doing, and hopefully the faculty here saw this. We're going out now regionally talking to universities. I'm meeting with folks from MD Anderson tomorrow, because again, convening the broad community and listening to people's concerns, and especially harvesting their ideas, is very, very important. And so we are moving forward quite nicely, I think, to solutions in some of these challenges, and also seizing opportunities. But this is going to be a process that plays out over some period of time. It's not going to be something where we just say, oh, we're done tomorrow. But I think that's a good thing, because we need to make sure to shape these directions, shape the culture change and stuff in the right way, so that we get to the right endpoint. So where we're at today with all of this, we've had numerous meetings, as many university presidents had, by the FBI and the National Academies over the last many, many months. J-Corps is, of course, focusing on these broader issues, and as I mentioned, these subcommittees have met at least 10 times. We're engaging, again, all sectors of the enterprise. I'm doing now regional meetings, and the international interest, as I mentioned, is very, very strong. And we actually had a big national summit on J-Corps just a few days ago in Washington, where we had leaders from all 4 sectors of our research enterprise coming together and getting an update on where we're at, but also giving their input, because we're moving very nicely, as I say, toward getting to solutions, getting to policies and things like that, and best practices for universities that we're working on with the universities and with the FBI, with the security agencies and community, because this really is something that we as a research community need to do. And so that summit, though, was different for a couple of reasons, where we're focusing, again, on all 4 of these issues, but also sharing some of our initial thoughts about where we're going with some of the answers to these challenges. And then finally, I want to just end by talking about the skilled workforce. We issued a report last December on STEM education. There have been lots and lots of STEM reports come out that are very good, very, very thoughtful. What is different about this one, and what I really love, is it started with convening the national community. So we brought from every state and territory 3 people, roughly, teachers, superintendents, parents, students, to come to Washington and talk about where we need to go as a nation in STEM education, what some of the challenges are, what some of the opportunities are, so that when this report came out, everybody could see themselves in that report. This report doesn't purport to tell local school districts what to do. That's not the job of the federal government. But it is the job of the whole community to come together and say, where do we want to go as a nation? Then everyone can kind of scaffold themselves into that. They see their role. They see the ability to align. And we just published an update on our progress in this, and we have all of the various kind of tasks and takeaways in there aligned with all of the various activities that are underway to show progress in each of the goal areas that we listed. So it will say, okay, here's a goal, how are we doing? Here's a goal, how are we doing? And so we're going to look to convene another national meeting here sometime probably in spring to bring these same folks back together and say, how are we doing? Let's not lose that connective tissue, that momentum of what's going on. So this is very, very exciting. And then also, of course, the workforce that is what we call the skilled technical workforce, which is between, say, high school degree and also not yet to a baccalaureate degree. So 2-year college, technical schools, career techs, things like that, very, very important in our enterprise. We have the Pledge to America's Workers, which is the pledge for over 350 companies to upskill or reskill more than 14 million people. So AI, some of these industries of the future, they're going to change the nature of work. And you might think, oh, they're going to displace a lot of people. What they're going to do is make the people who have certain types of jobs more upwardly mobile. So, for example, a welder. Okay, a welder who is very, very skilled in welding, I mean, it takes great skill to be a welder. They're now going to be operating machines and robots that do welding, but they're going to still need that skill in welding. But guess what? They're going to be making more money. They need more capabilities to understand how to operate these robotic machines. So it gives them an opportunity for upward economic mobility, and that's a very, very positive thing. Finally, how many finallys do you have? I got a couple, 3 more, I guess, but very quickly, PCAST. Again, the Baker Institute on the right wrote this fabulous report. Ken Evans. Ken, are you here tonight? I had never met Ken until, there he is, has done extraordinary work, and then Kristen Kirsten right down here. I met Kirsten, but I'd never met Kenneth. This is a really, really important document because there'd never been a report that really talked about what PCAST is and does. And so they're actually doing the oral histories now that Neil mentioned. But we reconstituted PCAST now, and the Trump administration just a couple of weeks ago announced the first tranche of individuals who'd actually gone through the clearance process. And it's a very exciting thing, and we've got a lot of neat things that we're doing. But I wanted to mention one thing that I've done that had never been done before. We're having a subcommittee in PCAST that it consists of undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, and non-academic early career professionals. Because believe me, those folks own the future, okay? And I'm an academic, and I'm around a lot of just like you all are, incredibly bright, talented, intellectually inspiring, super creative individuals. And I feel that they need to be at the table at PCAST, as well as these wonderful sort of mid to senior career people who have great wisdom and knowledge, who are members of PCAST themselves. They're the 16 members of PCAST. But these other folks that we call part of the SPEC committee, the student, professional, early career folks, they're going to add enormous intellectual energy. There can be 20 of them. And they're going to work alongside PCAST, but also bring their own ideas to the table. I'm really, really excited about this because think of an undergraduate serving on a President's Council of Advisors in Science Technology. I think it's going to be a great experience for them, and we're going to get a great deal out of that. We got a lot of stuff going on in other areas of PCAST or of OSTP. I just wanted to show you, for example, a few things in science, our science division, quantum industries of the future, ocean decadal vision. We got a big ocean summit coming up. But I wanted to show you some of the things we're working on. You may not know all of what OSTP does, but look at the list of topics that we work on. We're very blessed to have some incredibly talented people in OSTP, and each one of these things typically either has a report associated with it or some policy outcome from it. And I just want you to know that there are some really, really wonderful, talented people really hard at work on these issues. And you just look at the broad cross-section of things from nanotechnology, physical sciences, polar science, resilient science technology, critical minerals, you name it, it's pretty much up there in our science division. Same thing for our technology division. Michael Kratsios, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States, recently confirmed in that title. He'd been running OSTP from the very early days before I got there and had done a really phenomenal job at it. And so he's kind of come from the tech world, and he's led this whole Industries of the Future initiative, which is really extraordinary and very, very important to have America leading the world, not only in the tech areas, but also in the principles that underlie that. And he's done an extraordinary job there. And you look at some of the areas in technology, you can see it there, privacy issues, robotics, autonomy, big data, connectivity and broadband, rural broadband. Hugely important to get broadband connectivity out to all parts of the country. So this is just some examples of what our tech division works on. And then some folks don't realize we do a lot of work in national security. So we were talking earlier about asteroids potentially hitting the planet, the very first one, near-Earth objects plan, a workshop. This is a very interesting, fascinating topic. And you look at all things like space weather, electromagnetic pulses, the vulnerability maybe of our grid infrastructure, things like that. We deal with a lot of things like that. And in national security, you look at some of these areas that we work on, very, very important. Cybersecurity, obviously important to bioeconomy, biodefense, and so on. So there's a lot of really, really great topics there. Some of the documents that we have forthcoming, you can just kind of look at them there. A National Plan for Civil Earth Observations, Federal Health IT Strategic Plan. We did a plan for tech and aging, and now there's a Healthy Longevity Initiative at the National Academy of Medicine. So we work very, very closely with a lot of other organizations on behalf of the nation to make sure that our science and engineering research enterprise is as strong as it can possibly be. And we also do a lot of international activities, and I apologize that I'm in all these pictures here, but it's about the only pictures I have. But I meet a lot with science ministers, and we all work together. Neil knows about the Carnegie meeting we have, and we had one recently in Germany. It's where 12 science ministers, including myself from representing the U.S. We don't have a science minister, but I go representing the U.S. We get together in a very informal discussion. It's structured, but it's very, very informal and off the record. And we have really frank conversations about the state of science and engineering in the world, and it's really a marvelous opportunity. So I just want you to be on the lookout for our annual S&T highlights report. We're putting together one for 2019, calendar 2019, and there's really extraordinary activity happening across all of the agencies. So science and technology is alive and well. There's extraordinary advances being made in energy R&D, in basic research, in astrophysics, even in meteorology. We're making some really wonderful advances. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this with you tonight. I hope you've learned a little bit about OSTP and what we're doing, and I really invite you to come and see me in Washington, or call me up if you have an idea, something you think I ought to know, something we're maybe not doing the way we should be doing. The only way I can make sure that we're getting better is to get input from all of you. So it's been a great privilege and honor to be with you tonight. Thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to the chat that Neil is going to facilitate here. So thank you very much. Oh, okay. Sorry. I knocked my mic.
Here's the pin. Not sure what country sent it to you.
Is it less than $20? Okay, yeah. I can accept it.
Less than 20. Thank you so much. All I can say is, wow. I mean, there's a lot going on. And one thing that struck me, Kelvin, as you spoke, is you're so focused on sort of rectifying what we've needed in this country for such a long time, and that's a serious focus on the future of the country in some kind of comprehensive, holistic way. We have all these agencies, they do tremendous things, and we have administrations that come and go. I was in one of them, and then there was another one that came, and then another one. And each administration has its plan of some sort or other, but we lack continuity. We really have never had a national plan developed. And the only chance of developing something like that is if you do it with all the sectors, as we've talked before. So you have to have buy-in for all of those. And then if the politicians change, okay, the fundamentals are still there and you can kill it, go on. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll get much of it with the questions. Have people picked up questions? Are there any questions? Okay, so we're doing that. So let me just start with a question that's not really to do with much of these things that we'll talk about in a minute. But before I got to the White House, I could not figure out how the place worked. And then I got over there and I thought, oh my God, I mean, this is how it works. But and I was sitting at NSF, and there's crazy decisions be made in the White House. I understand why. Didn't like the result. Of course, I had good relations with science advisor and so forth, but couldn't really understand the mechanism. Not a lot of people involved, and lots going on. Mm-hmm. But maybe you had a much better perspective of what it was all going to be when you got there, and if so, that's terrific. Any surprises?
So I think the document that you wrote, Neil, that memo really prepared me well, and I won't go into any detail about what Neil said in there, but it was really extraordinary and written in the way that Neil always does things. It's very insightful, very thoughtful, very respectful in terms of how he portrayed various parts of the whole enterprise, and I found it extraordinarily useful. And going into the job, I thought, I wonder if it's, that was what, 20 some years ago. I thought, I wonder if this is still true. And I sort of read it many times, actually, to make sure I really internalize it. And I found most of what you said to be true, that relationships are extremely important. People come and go, and so you need to work very hard at building those relationships. And that's sort of how you get things done. And also, you focus on events. When you're rolling something out, and my communications director here, Christina Baum, who's extraordinary, and also I should also introduce my deep apologies, I didn't do this originally, but Dr. Lisa Nichols here is with me, the Assistant Director for Academic Engagement at OSTP. It's a new position we created to really kind of make sure that we have somebody waking up every day thinking and working toward academic engagement, even though a lot of us do that all the time, but she's really extraordinary. And then Christina Baum is here, and she's our communications director. And so Christina, and others have kind of told me, if you're going to do something, you need to tie it to a particular event. So there are lots of little nuggets, Neil, of what you wrote in there that I found really, really valuable. The thing that surprised me the most, I had to buy my own business cards. That was really a downer. The University of Oklahoma, literally, this is what I was a brand new assistant professor at OU. I come into the building where we were at the time. It's kind of a rundown building, has a window air conditioner, an old wooden army desk. The whole office is bare, filing cabinet stuff, but the rest, just nothing anywhere. On the desk was a box of business cards. and it said Kelvin Droegemeier, assistant professor. And I will never forget that moment, because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm no longer a graduate student. I'm actually a professor. I've actually done what I really wanted to do. And then you go to Washington, it's like, yeah, you got to buy everything yourself, buy your business cards. Believe me, they're not cheap, but they're beautiful. So, no, I think partly due to you, Neil, and the fact that you graciously involved me in that effort in the Baker Institute to look at providing a document that guides the next OSTP director, whoever she or he is. And then also having worked with OSTP, I learned a little bit about it working with John Holdren and Jack Marburger, but until you're actually there, you don't really understand it. But you prepared me well. You prepared me very well.
Thank you. I have no idea what I wrote, but I'm glad to hear that it was some help. So I'm going to turn, I got lots of questions in my head, but we also have lots of questions in the audience. Let's take those. So how are we going to incentivize companies to work more closely with university? I mean, there are some barriers there, and they're going to require either some changes in laws or regulations or other kinds of incentives. You've thought a lot about that.
Right, yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think one of the things we need to do is to help companies understand what universities really do. And I think generally, the general public doesn't necessarily have and understandably so, have a broad appreciation, even if most people have gone to a university. I think most people say, okay, the cost of higher education is high, and we produce graduates. And you know that some universities do research, you hear about it, but there's a lot of capabilities that universities have that I think a lot of people don't really understand or really appreciate. And I think that's sort of on us in the academic community. I count myself still an academic because I'm on leave of absence from OU, to really explain to a private company. And also the fact that we work very, very differently and even use different terminology. We use the term indirect cost and overhead for our facilities administrative costs. Those words mean something extremely different to a private company, and very, very different to them than a university. So I think it's a cultural issue, but I do think there are some structural barriers like intellectual property and things like that that we have to explain to companies. What I've found is if you get that stuff out of the way up front, it really smooths the way. The problem is if you start talking with a company and you get pretty deep in the conversation, all of a sudden, okay, we can't indemnify you, by the way. We can't do this, we can't do that. It kind of makes the conversation very difficult. So I think the more that you can, right up front, not just talk about the differences, but how the differences are a good thing. The private company and the universities are very, very different, but bringing them together creates a very powerful capability that neither has on their own. So that's part of it.
I commented on that I was impressed with your focus on long-term planning, the 25, 50 year. Here's a question that says, yeah, that's all very good, but what if we're not here? I mean, given the threats of climate change and other kinds of threats on human existence, even let alone the sort of specifics that we dealt with through century, these are kind of existential in some ways. And so, how do you weigh that into your advising and your analysis and your policy direction?
Well, I think it's a great question, whoever asked that, thank you. And it's very consistent with thinking ahead at an appropriate timescale of 25 to 50 years of what the planet will look like, what the state of the planet will be, and making sure that we are doing everything we can to understand what that state will look like. And so in that sense, making sure that we are maximizing the capabilities of our climate projection models, which right now, because of the way that our computer systems are being designed and built, really extract about 6% of the total machine performance out of those machines. So we do field these extraordinarily powerful computers, but our climate models are not being able to be run at the degree of sophistication in which they actually are designed and they have capability. So that's something I would like to see us work on. I think we saw Japan build something called the Earth Simulator in the early 2000s. It's a very intriguing idea. And this is a question that actually the National Academies is looking at right now, is what do we do in terms of computation for Earth science and for atmospheric science going forward? And I think the study is pretty close to being funded, and I think that'll be a very important a path forward in terms of how we address some of these issues.
Here's a question about J-Core and addressing issues that you talked about, diversity, value of diversity, inclusivity, and so on. So the questioner, I think, is wondering, how do you balance that against just sort of raw intellectual merit of an idea, of a proposal? You faced this at NSF for many years, the broader impacts criterion, for example, that actually happened on my watch. Sorry, don't stone me, but So there it is, and that balance then has to be struck. So what is your thinking, not just about the NSF reviews, but in general? How does one do this? If you go all the way in one direction, in the end, you don't have anything much left in the way of scientific advancement. If you go the other way, which is where we traditionally have gone, then you lose the richness of the community. You probably lose a lot of the great ideas that come from diversity and from being more inclusive. How do you approach this? How should agencies approach this?
What I would like to see us do, and this may be a sort of a Pollyannish response, but I don't think so. I think we need to start thinking of diversity not as sort of something else, but totally integrated with our thinking about intellectual merit, because our ideas have great robustness and our opportunities for research and the methods by which we attack a problem have great robustness when we bring diversities of ideas forward. So I understand the second review criterion in NSF, the broader impacts and things like that, but I think we've got to start baking diversity into our thinking from day one. And so at OSTP, when I think about meetings, I think about PCAST, I think about anything like that, diversity is just always there. It didn't come automatically, and it came over a period of years when I had colleagues, one in particular, who taught me how to think about diversity. And you can think about it in sort of a cold, calculated way and say, you know, the demographics of our country are evolving in such a way that if we don't have diversity, we won't have the workforce. Well, okay, that's true. That's a true statement. But then you think about, wait a second, you know, there's a great richness of ideas and a great richness of investigation and study and understanding when you bring diverse viewpoints forward. I like that much, much better. And then the third piece is, you know, everybody in this country ought to have an opportunity to participate in the enterprise. Now, I come from Oklahoma, which is a state which is traditionally doesn't get as much funding from external agencies. There are various sort of programs that are created to help that. And so I really like the opportunity to build capacity in institutions that don't traditionally perform as well as they can. And so, you know, we really have to make sure that those institutions contribute and that everyone has an opportunity to contribute. There's a wonderful top-line person at NIH. He's a very top-line leader. I won't mention his name, but he still has an active lab. He's a very, very senior person, very renowned person. He said, I only hire postdocs in my lab who come from places like Montana and Idaho and, you know, Wyoming and Oklahoma and EPSCoR states like that. He said, guess where they're at now? They're at HHMI, they're at Johns Hopkins and so on. And I just wanted to give him a hug because he said, what he's doing is he's giving opportunity to people who are just sort of oftentimes passed by because they didn't come from, you know, some of our top tier schools. Well, believe me, if you go visit virtually any university of this country, you find extraordinary things going on. So we have to find ways that we don't think of diversity and inclusion as something we have to do as a separate activity, but it needs to be baked into what we do. And that's where I think we've got to get to, Neil. Easier said than done, but I think our STEM plan is one mechanism to make that happen.
Should we talk about EPA, if we have time? So today, New York Times had an article on EPA's release for public comment on their new regulation with regard to the use of science in setting policies on air and water pollution. And as I understand it, but I've only read the article, what it really suggests is that unless the data is open, available to the public, all of the data, nothing but the data, they're not going to use the rule. They're not going to use the science. They'll use other science. And the point they're making is reproducibility is the whole thing. If you don't turn your data over to the public so that other people can have a chance to reproduce it, then it's not worth as much. And the argument against that is that a lot of this data is protected by privacy agreements and sort of medical data, health data, so forth. What are your thoughts about such, if not that policy in particular, making an EPA or another agency proceeding in this way? What's the role of OSTP? What's your role as science advisor in helping, if you can?
Yeah, like you, I haven't read that actual rule, so I'd like to do that. I know this kind of an idea was floated earlier, I believe, and I don't know if it's been changed or whatever. There is an evidence-based policy-making act that is out there, and I think you want to make sure that the evidence is brought forward. The National Academies recently released a report on reproducibility and replicability in science, which I think is a really important part of this conversation, because until that happened, there wasn't really clarity on what we even meant by reproducibility and replicability in science. And so I think that report is sort of a kind of a guiding mechanism for us to understand what this even means and how it ought to be applied in a variety of circumstances. There's also the issue of open science, as you know, and open data, and making results from research openly available. But there's always, as you mentioned, Neil, the important caveat that some of the data they contain personally identified information, they contain protected health information, they might contain proprietary information for companies. So I think we have to look at that in the context of this new report on reproducibility and really understand how all that fits together.
We're going to talk about climate change, right? So you've spoken out publicly on what the climate science, what it says, but I think the audience would be interested in your position on climate change, by what mechanisms in your position you can advise on those subjects. This questioner wants to know specifically about the Paris Agreement, since there seems to be increasing interest on the part of states and even corporations in staying with the Paris Accord, and of course we appear not to be doing that. I think that initial decision occurred before you came on board, but anyway. What are your thoughts about climate change and where the U.S. should be going?
Sure.
And how the science is progressing?
So obviously the climate is changing, and it changes constantly. And the question is, there's natural variability versus anthropogenic effects. And I've testified before Congress that the anthropogenic effects are significant. There's no question in my mind about that. I've been, have interviews where this has been put forward, so it's absolutely the case. I think ultimately the view is that a strong economy is the best way to address these issues through technological innovations. Right here in Texas, fracking first occurred, and who would have thought that fracking would release all this untapped potential in shale gas reserves and oil and things like that. And that was revolutionary. It was really, really extraordinary. And so I think we're looking at technological solutions to lead the way. The Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy, is funding a lot of very, very important work in things like carbon capture. They're funding work in advanced nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, things like that. Also, thin film devices for solar panels and things like that to really up the game. And then also things like offshore wind, exploration of things. We're actually looking to map the exclusive economic zone around the U.S. and our Ocean Science Technology Summit that'll be held Thursday is going to be looking at that in particular. So I think these are some of the important things that we're looking to do. With regard to Paris, of course, the president made the determination, a year and a half ago, I think it was or so, that the Paris Agreement was not a good deal for America. He's followed through on that now with, I think, the initial steps to pull out of the Paris Agreement. I was struck by the fact that not long ago, maybe 6 months ago or whatever it was, the original goals that were set for Paris were found to be insufficient, that actually hit the 1.5 degree mark. I think the increase would be a factor of 3, and to hit the 2 degree mark would be a factor of 5 from the original goals. So that's not a criticism one way or the other. It's just a data point to say that I think one of the concerns was these emissions contributions and commitments by countries could change all over the place. And then you have China emitting twice as much as what we are, and through their Belt and Road Initiative, putting power plants all over parts of Asia, and that doesn't count toward their emission totals at all. So it's a very, very complicated issue. The main thing that I really focus on is to make sure that our climate science is as strong as it can possibly be, that science is at the table when policy decisions are made and discussed. And I know Neil had that same situation in a variety of things when he was at the White House. And of course, a lot of things impact policy. It might be the national economy, it might be national security, it's certainly politics do impact policy, all appropriately so. But it's important that the science advisor make sure that the science, peer-reviewed science, high-quality science is there as part of the conversation. And that's what I try to do.
This questioner points out that most real breakthroughs come from basic fundamental research.
Yeah.
And yet you really didn't emphasize that very much. And I guess that sort of raises the question, do policymakers actually care about that? Do they understand that? Or do they just take it for granted and say, well, of course, basic fundamental research is really important. We naturally will fund to that. So when you're having these conversations, how do you make those choices and what to focus on?
So perhaps remiss on my part that I didn't mention that, but if you look at the R&D priorities memo that I showed you, of which I mentioned the 5, R&D areas and the 5 crosscuts, it points out in there very clearly that basic discovery research, early stage research is very important. It was in the budget narrative, last year's budget, and I think the budget before, so there's no question about it. The point that I made about the high intellectual risk, that's all basic research, okay? I mean, I didn't say it explicitly, but when you're talking high intellectual risk, you're not talking R&D that's applied or development work, you're talking very fundamental science. So I think I did mention that, robust budgets are very important. Vannevar Bush, it was his top line point, and it certainly remains true today. So no question about it. And I guess to me, I just always take it for granted because it's in everything we do, all the documents we have that points out that early stage, I think that's a phrase that we use, early stage discovery, basic research is always extremely important. So absolutely remains the case today. I'm glad you asked the question just so that there wasn't somebody walking out of the room thinking, wow, basic research isn't important. So it certainly is.
Quantum computing, where are we? Where are we going to be there? Is this a 50-year thing, a 20-year thing, a 10-year thing?
Yeah, so the announcement that was made recently by a private company noting quantum supremacy, that's a big deal. It happened in a private company, which is great, but that private company was started and funded by basic research funding from the National Science Foundation. So I think that's a great thing. It's a great example of American ingenuity. We strongly celebrate that. There's extraordinary activities and massive investment going on in quantum information science and quantum computing in the private sector. We are investing substantially in the federal government and will continue to do so, and hoping to see continued investments in those areas. But this is where I think especially, and I'm glad you brought that up, where we have universities working with private companies. In fact, many companies, IBM and others, have said, we build these quantum computers, we want you working on them. And Google that did the quantum supremacy, they said, we're going to open this up. And I asked the question, I got briefed on this. I said, so I'm somebody who knows Fortran. I hate to admit that publicly, but so I know Fortran. Okay, I want to play around with your quantum computer. What do I need to do that? I mean, it's not like you program an assembly language. What is it? And they said, well, you basically would need to take a course in quantum computing that are all over universities these days. So I said, well, that's cool. I'd like to do that, So very, very important thing, Neil. As a weather guy, I can tell you that radar will benefit massively from quantum science. Quantum computing, of course, is important, but there's quantum sensing, quantum communication. These areas, they'll be transformed absolutely by quantum science. So it's very exciting. I'll tell you what's really cool. You'd love this as a physicist, right? The general public is really juiced about quantum, right? But if you've ever taken a course in quantum mechanics or quantum physics, you're like, this is really weird stuff. And it's really ironic that something that I think most people find completely bizarre, everybody is just on the bandwagon about. And I think that is really, really wonderful. So how did you do in your course in quantum physics?
I wrote a book.
Okay. All right. He wrote the book.
Actually, to be honest, my graduate student wrote the book. And one of my physics colleagues and I signed on as co-authors. No, I guess slightly a bit more. It was a book on quantum mechanics, and it came out of a course we taught. And so my colleague, Tom Estel, physics professor, and I had written notes because we didn't like any of the textbooks. And so the graduate student, who was working on his thesis at the time, and I had given him a problem that was impossible already. And now he wants to write this book. He's an excellent writer named Mike Morrison.
Oh, I was going to ask you if it was Mike,
Met him and
University
did an extraordinary job.
By the way.
And Rush Holt, who's former congressman from New Jersey and then chief executive officer for the AAAS more recently, whenever he was at a public event where I was there, I'm sure he didn't do it in general, said, I always use Neil Lane's textbook in my quantum mechanics class. But do I understand it? No. I mean, yeah.
I don't either.
No, but it's the most accurate theory known to human beings. It's been measured because you can actually measure at precision. But philosophically, the brain's, at least mine, is not wired that way. No. China, let's talk about China.
Okay.
So you point out that in terms of overall R&D investment, all sources, the China curve is coming up steeply against the U.S. curve, and according to the National Science Board, if you use purchasing power parity power conversion, they crossed in 2018. Right. We don't know if they did or not, but they're very close. Mm-hmm. So the investment is huge and steep. So now we go another 20 years, and it'll be out of sight. China trains way more engineers than we do. They publish more papers than we do, and increasingly they're publishing in most highly cited journals. They're almost up to the U.S. in terms of the creation of Fortune 500 companies. That's by foreign-born, not all China, I think, is that number. Anyway, my point is, all those curves of China investment, all kinds of investment in science and technology, and then translating those results into market are steep, and they're up. And the U.S. seems to be, and now I'm just talking about government, U.S. in general seems to be sort of, what is the word, resting on our laurels. Everything will be okay. We care about this next quarterly report. We care about getting out the next product that didn't exist 18 months ago. That part's not all bad, but it's not matching the sort of long-term strategic investment that China's making. Now, what you're doing in terms of putting these summits together, writing these plans, these long-range strategic plans, is in that direction. But meanwhile, we're losing ground fast. It seems. That's at least the claim. Is that too strong a statement?
I think it may be a little bit too strong. China is investing a lot, but they've come a long way. It's true, but they still have a long way to go. And so, I think for me, I don't know that we could outspend China, and I don't know we should try. But I think two things. I think we have this incredible enterprise that I talked about. That if we leverage our resources, we can extract more out of what we already have. That's number one. The second thing I think is that we can outvalue China. So when I mention those two values, those two sets of values, China absolutely does not play by the rules. Okay, they simply don't. That's a fact, and they're not shy about saying that either. Okay, they're not going to probably change. Fine, that's just the way it is. So we have to both protect ourselves, but I think then play a very strong offense. I think we have to work to make sure that we are using every dollar as effectively as possible. We have to make sure that we are bringing the best and brightest to America who want to come and study here and stay here, as the president has said, and then also make sure that they play by the rules as researchers. That, I think, is a much easier thing for them to do, to play by the rules as researchers, rather than have China give reciprocity, which I don't think they have any plan to do. And I think that's very, very unfortunate, because it's not good for, I think, the international research enterprise to have China as a nation behave this way. I don't think it's healthy at all. It's not good for science. It'd be much better if we could collaborate and everyone would play by the rules, and that's simply not the case. So what we're trying to do in J-Corps is to strike that balance between the openness that we think is important and also protecting our assets without tying our hands unnecessarily. And I truly believe in our American values. I believe in research values, and researchers also believe in research values. Nobody wants people in their laboratories who are falsifying, fabricating, plagiarizing, whatever, and also failing to report things that they should be reporting. So I think we have to strongly make sure that folks who come here feel welcome. We don't want to stigmatize any type of people group or anything like that. But we have to recognize that whether you're from Norman, Oklahoma, or you're from Beijing, China, you need to play by the rules. And if you don't, if you're not willing to do that, and sometimes China exerts enormous pressure on people that come here to subvert our own system at their benefit and our expense. So we have to address this issue. We're living in a very, very challenging time. But frankly, I think it's a time of enormous opportunity for us. Enormous opportunity for us to message to our students, to our faculty, of the values we hold, the values that they hold dear, and how with those values, leading with those values with our international partners, we can really make sure that those with whom we collaborate do play by the rules, and that we have folks from China coming here working with us, but which we want, and hopefully this will resolve in a very positive way where we will see collaboration and move science forward internationally, which is what we all want to see. And I hope China does realize this, and I think President Trump has been working hard with these trade negotiations with China to try to exact some promises on intellectual property theft and things like that, which are extremely important, and I think we all agree. In fact, it's been told that we have anywhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion of intellectual property theft happening every year in some of these critical areas. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of work, hard work of people here with taxpayers' dollars in America, not benefiting America, but benefiting China. We want to collaborate, but we need to do it in the right way, and we need people who are going to behave by the rules. Yeah.
But meanwhile, statements that are made by the administration and actions being taken are frightening to many foreign-born students and members of the faculty, Chinese Americans, because it's not entirely clear where it's going. And to many of us, of course, in part, I guess, because many of these investigations are classified and we can't know how serious the issues really, how serious and how frequent the occurrences really are. It's clear that some people have misbehaved, but often the people who are making these decisions in some of our agencies of government that are not really science central are not scientists. Mm-hmm. And the distinction between a research collaboration, the give and take, the value to America, as opposed to giving away all our secrets, mm-hmm. are not so clear. And I know you have an opportunity to talk with these people through JCOR. Right. How do you bring them along?
So you're right. JCOR is a mechanism by which we bring them together, and we have brought in, the State Department, national security agencies, the law enforcement, FBI, and so on. And I have to say, they're really terrific partners in this. They understand the threats, but they're not all just saying, okay, let's close the borders, let's lock it all down. They understand the importance of having a balance. And so the conversations are extraordinarily productive, and I think we're getting to a good place to where we will have the right policy prescriptions put into place, universities doing what they need to do, having best practices that we're developing in concert with the universities. I think this is very, very important in terms of how this is folding out, and I think it's happening that way because we are all working together and collaborating. And we talked earlier about how different agencies they see things through a particular lens, obviously, and that's appropriate. But when you get everybody in a room, they start to learn from one another, and their views start to be informed by other viewpoints. And they're saying, oh, I didn't see it that way, but now that you say it, I can see your point. And so we have to continue doing that. And that's really the value of JCOR. And I have to say, these folks that are involved with this, and this is really at the top level of these agencies, I'm very, very encouraged by what I see. And I also have to say that the Congress as well, they've obviously introduced some bills. They're extremely interested in this, and we've been gauging the Hill. They're also important and very, very good collaborators. The productive meetings I've had with senior leadership in Congress that are very interested in the research security issue have been very productive. So, we won't know until all is said and done, but I'm very encouraged compared to maybe where things were, 8-10 months ago.
Okay, last one. What's the weather going to be tomorrow?
All right. Now, where do you want to know the weather?
Honolulu.
Honolulu. I don't have Honolulu, but I have Cozumel. It's raining in Cozumel. In Chicago, it's 14 right now. Barrow, Alaska, on the North Slope is 15 degrees. And Houston tomorrow is going to be mostly cloudy. Sorry. But it's better than clear skies.
Okay.
Clear skies. Don't you think clear skies are boring? I got to ask you.
It's what?
Don't you think clear skies are boring? I mean, as a physicist, don't you like to see stuff moving around? And
yeah, actually, that's what got me into science, was these tornadoes. I was the last kid in the storm cellar. On the other hand, our storm cellar had rats in it, so I just had a trade-off. Thank you so much for being here, Kelvin.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
I'm going to send all these...